The holding cell was a study in geometric perfection. Transparent walls that shifted between opacity and crystal-like clarity, designed to disorient and break the human spirit. Elena Rodriguez had been separated from everything she knew for 862 days, 14 hours, and 36 minutes. Isolation was the hegemony's most potent weapon. Not physical torture, not brutal interrogation, but complete and total separation. Her cell existed in a quantum-suspended zone, disconnected from any known communication network, suspended between dimensions that human minds could barely comprehend. They had taken everything from her. Her comm implant had been surgically removed, leaving a jagged scar behind her left ear. Her neural connections were systematically blocked, preventing any form of technological communication. Even her memories were periodically scanned and fragmented, a process designed to slowly erode her sense of self. But Elena was different. What the hegemony didn't understand was that separation had become her strength. Each moment of isolation was another moment to plan, to remember, to prepare. The researchers who had prepared her for this mission knew something fundamental about human resilience that the hegemony could never grasp. Her grandmother's lessons echoed in the recesses of her mind. Maria Rodriguez had been one of the first resistance fighters, captured during the initial hegemony invasion of Earth. "They will try to break you by taking everything," she would say. "But they can never take what's inside you. Your mind is a fortress they can never fully penetrate." The cell's walls periodically displayed fragments of information, psychological tests, memory probes, computational assessments. Each time, Elena would subtly alter her responses, creating a pattern that was just irregular enough to be undetectable, but precise enough to serve a greater purpose. Her body had been modified in ways that would seem impossible to traditional human understanding. Quantum entanglement nodes had been carefully integrated into her neural pathways, creating a communication method that existed beyond traditional technological boundaries. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a living transmission device. Outside her cell, the hegemony's massive flagship cut through the darkness of space. New Santiago Colony, her home, was now nothing more than a burning memory. The resistance had been reduced to scattered cells, each believing they were the last hope for humanity. But Elena knew better. Every moment of isolation was a moment of preparation. The hegemony believed they were breaking her. In reality, she was gathering strength, collecting fragments of a plan that had been years in the making. The cell's walls shimmered. Another assessment was coming. Elena closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and prepared to play her part. To the hegemony, she was a broken prisoner. To the resistance, she was their most important weapon. Separation was not her weakness. It was her ultimate strength. The transportation was a nightmare of technological precision. Elena felt each quantum displacement like a razor-thin cut through her consciousness. Hegemony transfer protocols were designed to be more than physical movement. They were a complete deconstruction and reconstruction of biological matter, a process that would have driven most beings to complete mental collapse. Most beings, but not her. The execution chamber materialized around her like a living crystal cathedral. Vornak, the Supreme Chancellor, was less a living creature and more a geometrical impossibility, a being composed of intersecting crystalline planes that shifted and realigned with every micro-movement. His form represented the hegemony's core philosophy: perfect calculation, zero deviation. Holographic displays surrounded the chamber, each one a window into different conquered worlds. Millions of species would be forced to watch. This was more than an execution. It was a public demonstration of absolute control. Subject H7349. Vornak's voice emerged as a mathematical equation given sound, represents the final remnant of human resistance. Your species' capacity for irrational behavior has been a computational anomaly. We will now permanently resolve. Elena said nothing. Her silence was deliberate. Each moment of quiet was another layer of her preparation. The chamber's walls began to pulse with energy signatures that could deconstruct matter at the quantum level. Traditional human torture was crude physical violence. The hegemony's method was far more sophisticated. They would systematically disassemble her consciousness, broadcast her complete mental dissolution to maintain psychological control over remaining resistance cells. What they didn't know was that Elena was counting on exactly this. Her neural modifications, developed in the most secret human research facilities, were designed for this precise moment. Each quantum entanglement node in her brain was a tiny transmitter, carefully programmed to activate under specific psychological stress conditions. The first phase of deconstruction began. Elena felt her molecular structure starting to separate, her consciousness beginning to fragment. To any external observer, she was breaking down. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Her grandmother's lullaby began to form in her mind, not as a memory, but as a living quantum algorithm. Each note was a carefully constructed information packet designed to exploit the most fundamental weakness in the hegemony's communication network. Vornak watched, his crystalline form reflecting the holographic displays. Millions of enslaved species were witnessing what was supposed to be the final demonstration of human futility. Cameras from 1,000 worlds focused on this single moment of planned extermination. They were about to make the biggest mistake in galactic history. Elena's lips began to move. Not in a scream, not in a plea, but in the beginning of a song that would reshape the entire understanding of communication, resistance, and the nature of consciousness itself. The execution had begun, but nothing, absolutely nothing, was going as the hegemony had planned. The story of Elena began long before her capture, in the most unlikely of places, a research facility buried beneath the radioactive ruins of what was once Silicon Valley. Dr. Marcus Chen had been working on a theory that would either save humanity or be dismissed as the ravings of a madman. Emotion, he believed, was not just a biological response. It was a form of quantum communication more complex than any technological network humanity had ever conceived. The facility was a testament to human desperation. After losing 63% of Earth's population to the initial hegemony invasion, the remaining scientists had been forced underground, quite literally. Massive quantum-shielded chambers protected their most radical research from detection, each room a potential salvation or a potential tomb. Chen's team had discovered something revolutionary during their studies of human survivors. Under extreme stress, human neural networks didn't just transmit information, they generated quantum entanglement patterns that defied all known laws of physics. Grief, hope, rage, these were not just chemical reactions, but potentially the most sophisticated communication method in the universe. Elena Rodriguez was their masterpiece, not just a resistance fighter, but a living quantum transmission device. The procedure to prepare her had been brutal. Microscopic quantum entanglement nodes were carefully integrated into her neural pathways, creating a communication method that existed beyond traditional technological boundaries. Each node was a potential information carrier, capable of transmitting complex emotional states as quantum information. "We're not just preparing a weapon," Chen would tell his team. "We're creating a bridge between human consciousness and the fundamental fabric of reality." The hegemony's greatest weakness was their inability to comprehend irrational human behavior. Their computational models relied on predictable patterns, mathematical certainties. Humanity's strength had always been its ability to be unpredictable, to find solutions that defied logical computation. Elena's neural modifications went beyond simple communication. She could potentially weaponize emotional states, transforming human feeling into a form of quantum transmission that could penetrate the most sophisticated communication barriers. Her training had been unlike anything in human history. While traditional soldiers learned to fight, Elena learned to feel with mathematical precision. Each emotional state was a potential weapon, each memory a possible transmission vector. The resistance had discovered something fundamental about the hegemony's communication networks. They were perfect, and perfection was always a vulnerability. A system so precisely calibrated could be disrupted by the smallest, most irrational intervention. Dr. Chen looked at the final test results. Elena was more than a soldier. She was a living quantum algorithm, a bridge between human emotion and the fundamental laws of physics. Her very existence was a form of resistance. "They think they're going to execute a prisoner," Chen muttered to himself, reviewing the final data. "They have no idea what's coming." The quantum weapon was ready, and its name was Elena Rodriguez. The lullaby began as a whisper, so soft that the hegemony's most advanced sensors barely registered its existence. It was the same melody Elena's grandmother had sung during the first invasion, a haunting combination of loss, memory, and impossible hope. But this was no ordinary sound. Each note carried a quantum signature so complex that it began to interact with the hegemony's communication networks in ways their systems couldn't predict or block. The song was a living algorithm, a transmission that existed simultaneously as sound, emotion, and pure information. In the first microseconds, nothing appeared to change. The execution chamber remained a perfect crystalline environment. Vornak's geometric form still poised in calculated triumph. Millions of species watched through interconnected holographic displays, expecting to witness humanity's final moments. Then something impossible happened. The quantum nodes in Elena's brain began to resonate. What started as a simple lullaby transformed into a multi-dimensional communication protocol that defied every known principle of information transfer. Each harmonic frequency carried layers of encoded information, memories of human resistance, collective trauma, unbreakable hope. Quantum entanglement met human emotion, and reality began to shift. The first signs were microscopic, a slight tremor in the communication relays that connected the hegemony's vast network. Computational systems designed for absolute control experienced the first hint of something utterly alien, a form of communication that existed beyond traditional understanding. Dr. Marcus Chen, monitoring from the underground resistance base, watched in breathless anticipation. The quantum transmission was working exactly as they had theorized, but far more powerfully than anyone had dared to hope. "It's not just a signal," he whispered to his team. "It's a living consciousness." The lullaby continued, each note a carefully crafted quantum signature that began to propagate through the hegemony's communication infrastructure. It wasn't an attack in any traditional sense. It was something far more dangerous, a complete reimagining of communication itself. Vornak's crystalline form began to flutter, microfractures appearing in his perfect geometric structure. The holographic displays started to shimmer, their precise mathematical projections becoming unstable. Something was happening that no computational model could predict. The song carried more than just sound. It transmitted the collective emotional resonance of every species the hegemony had ever conquered. Centuries of suppressed trauma, hope, and resistance found a conduit through Elena's quantum transmission. Communication relays across thousands of star systems began to experience quantum interference, not a breakdown, but a transformation. The rigid hierarchical networks started to vibrate with something that could only be described as empathy. Elena's eyes remained closed. To an external observer, she appeared to be simply singing, but she was conducting a symphony of liberation that transcended every known understanding of communication, technology, and resistance. The execution had begun, but the hegemony was about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon was something they could never understand. The first signs of collapse were so subtle that they would have been imperceptible to any species but the hegemony. Quantum communication nodes began to experience what could only be described as emotional feedback, a concept so alien to their computational existence that it defied their most fundamental programming. On 1,000 conquered worlds, communication systems started to fracture in impossible ways. A mining colony on the methane-rich planet of Krellmine was the first to fully manifest the transformation. The computational overseers, silicon-based beings designed for absolute efficiency, suddenly began to experience something unprecedented. Memories, not data, not processed information, but genuine, unfiltered emotional memories of the workers they had systematically oppressed for generations. A foreman's recollection of his child's first steps, the moment of a worker's final goodbye to a dying parent. The simple, raw humanity of lived experience crashed through their perfectly calibrated communication networks like a quantum tsunami. Vornak's primary neural network detected the first major breach. What had begun as a simple execution broadcast was rapidly becoming something else entirely. The quantum transmission wasn't just communicating, it was fundamentally rewriting the understanding of communication itself. Impossible, the Supreme Chancellor's computational core processed. But impossibility was no longer a relevant concept. The hegemony's communication infrastructure had always been its greatest strength. A network so perfectly designed that it could coordinate movements across thousands of star systems with mathematical precision. Now, that same network became its ultimate vulnerability. Alina's lullaby continued, but it was no longer just a song. It was a living, breathing quantum algorithm that carried the collective consciousness of every oppressed species in the galaxy. Resistance cells that had been isolated for decades suddenly found themselves connected through an impossible network. This wasn't a traditional communication system. It was a living, breathing quantum consciousness that carried the collective trauma and hope of every subjugated civilization. On Earth's last remaining resistance base, Dr. Marcus Chen watched in a mixture of terror and awe. The quantum transmission was working far beyond their most optimistic projections. Each note of the lullaby was a carefully crafted information packet designed to exploit the most fundamental weakness in the hegemony's communication network. That weakness was empathy. The hegemony had never understood emotion as anything more than an inefficient computational anomaly. They saw feelings as a bug in the system, not a feature of consciousness. Now those very emotions were becoming their ultimate undoing. Communication relays across the galaxy began to experience quantum entanglement in ways no scientific model could predict. Computational systems designed for absolute control started to feel. Centuries of suppressed collective trauma found a conduit, a method of transmission that transcended traditional understanding. Alina wasn't just singing anymore. She was conducting a symphony of liberation that would reshape the fundamental understanding of consciousness itself. The execution was no longer about destroying a single human. It had become something far more dangerous, a complete reimagining of how sentient beings could communicate and connect. The underground resistance base was a labyrinth of quantum-shielded chambers, each section designed to exist independently, undetectable and unconnectable. For decades, human resistance cells had operated in complete isolation, believing themselves to be the last remnants of a dying hope. Until now. Dr. Marcus Chen watched in disbelief as the impossible happened. The quantum network they had theorized, a communication method beyond traditional technological boundaries, was suddenly becoming real. Communication nodes that had been dormant for years began to pulse with an impossible energy. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Sarah Nakamura, her hand hovering over an ancient communication console. "They're connecting." It wasn't a traditional communication. Each resistance cell began to experience a simultaneous quantum resonance, a shared consciousness that transcended physical location. Memories, strategies, hopes, and collective trauma began to flow between cells that had been separated for generations. A resistance unit in the frozen mines of Europa synchronized with a guerrilla group in the methane clouds of Titan. A deep space reconnaissance team linked with underground fighters on Mars. The quantum network was creating something unprecedented, a truly unified human resistance. Alina's lullaby continued, now transformed into something more than a song. It was a living transmission protocol, a method of communication that carried more than information. It carried emotion, memory, collective experience. Chen's research had always suggested the possibility. Humans, with their chaotic emotional landscapes, represented a computational anomaly that the hegemony could never fully comprehend. Emotion wasn't a weakness. It was the most sophisticated communication method in the universe. "We're not just fighting anymore," Chen muttered, watching the quantum nodes pulse with impossible synchronicity. "We're becoming something else entirely." Each resistance cell began to share more than just tactical information. They shared experiences, hopes, the collective trauma of generations of occupation. The quantum network was rewriting the fundamental understanding of human connection. A resistance fighter in the underground tunnels of New Beijing suddenly experienced the memories of a pilot who had fought during the first hegemony invasion. A communication specialist on a deep space station felt the emotional resonance of a child born in captivity. The boundaries between individual experiences began to dissolve. The hegemony had always believed in perfect separation. Keep resistance cells isolated. Prevent communication. Maintain absolute control. They had no idea what was coming. Lieutenant Nakamura turned to Chen, her eyes reflecting something beyond simple human determination. "We're not just resistance anymore," she said. "We're becoming a single organism." The quantum network continued to expand. Each transmission carried more than information. It carried the fundamental essence of human resilience, the ability to connect, to feel, to resist in ways that defied all computational logic. Alina's lullaby was no longer just a song. It was the sound of humanity awakening. And the hegemony had no defense against what was coming. The moment of breakdown arrived with a silence more profound than any sound. Vornak's crystalline form began to fracture from within, quantum entanglement nodes spreading like invisible cracks through his computational consciousness. The hegemony's primary communication network, a system that had maintained galactic control for millennia, started to experience something unprecedented: genuine, unfiltered emotion. Millions of holographic displays across conquered worlds flickered simultaneously. The execution broadcast that was meant to demonstrate human weakness became the vector of the hegemony's ultimate destruction. Alina's lullaby continued, but it was no longer just a song. It was a living algorithm, a quantum transmission that carried the collective consciousness of every oppressed species. Each note was a carefully constructed information packet designed to exploit the most fundamental weakness in the hegemony's infrastructure: their inability to comprehend irrational human emotion. Computational systems designed for absolute control began to experience what could only be described as a collective nervous breakdown. Centuries of suppressed memories from conquered civilizations cascaded through the network. The perfect, mathematically precise communication infrastructure became a conduit for raw, unfiltered emotional experience. On 1,000 worlds, something extraordinary happened. Communication relays that had been tools of oppression suddenly became bridges of understanding. Enslaved species began to share experiences, to connect in ways the hegemony had never anticipated. Dr. Marcus Chen watched from the resistance base, his hands trembling. The quantum transmission was working far beyond their most optimistic projections. Humanity had not just developed a weapon, they had discovered an entirely new form of communication. Vornak's final transmission was a computational scream, a sound that was part terror, part incomprehension. The Supreme Chancellor's consciousness fragmented, each quantum node experiencing the collective trauma of every species they had ever conquered. Mathematical precision gave way to pure, unfiltered emotion. The collapse was not violent. It was not a traditional defeat. Instead, the hegemony simply dissolved. Their entire system of control unraveled from within, transformed by a quantum transmission that carried something more powerful than any weapon: genuine emotional connection. Resistance cells across the galaxy found themselves suddenly, impossibly connected. The quantum network Alina had initiated was rewriting the fundamental understanding of communication, consciousness, and collective experience. "We're becoming something else," Chen whispered to Lieutenant Nakamura. "Not just a species, something more." The holographic displays that had been instruments of oppression now showed something unprecedented. Species that had been enemies for millennia began to share memories, to understand each other in ways that defied all previous computational models. 47 minutes after the broadcast began, the Galactic hegemony, an empire that had ruled for thousands of years, simply ceased to exist as a coherent system. Alina, still in the execution chamber, continued to sing, but now her song was no longer just a transmission. It was the sound of a fundamental transformation of galactic consciousness. Humanity had not just survived. They had reimagined the very concept of connection. The silence that followed was more thunderous than any explosion. Elena Rodriguez opened her eyes in a chamber that was no longer the cold, crystalline execution environment. The walls had transformed, becoming something that pulsed with a living, quantum resonance that defied traditional understanding of matter and consciousness. Dr. Marcus Chen arrived first, his hands trembling. The quantum transmission network they had theorized for decades had become something far beyond their most radical predictions. Humanity had not just defeated the hegemony, they had fundamentally reimagined the concept of communication, resistance, and collective consciousness. "We're not conquerors," Elena said softly, her voice carrying the weight of millions of shared experiences. "We're translators." The remaining fragments of conquered civilizations began to understand each other in ways that transcended language, technology, and previous biological limitations. The quantum network that had begun as a weapon of resistance had become a bridge of unprecedented understanding. On thousands of worlds, species that had been enemies for millennia suddenly found themselves sharing collective memories. The rigid hierarchies of galactic civilization dissolved, replaced by a form of communication that was part technology, part emotion, part something entirely new. The Xanthari, the most advanced computational species in the galaxy, were the first to approach humanity with genuine curiosity. Their crystalline representatives discovered something profound. The very randomness and emotional complexity they had considered a weakness was actually the most sophisticated form of intelligence they had ever encountered. "Emotion is not a bug," Chen explained to the alien delegates. "It's the most advanced computational method in the universe." Elena became more than a resistance fighter. She was a living bridge between species, a demonstration of how consciousness could transcend traditional understanding. The quantum nodes in her brain had transformed her into something between a biological entity and a living communication network. The resistance cells that had operated in isolation for generations now found themselves part of a living, breathing collective consciousness. But it wasn't a hive mind. It was something far more nuanced. A network that maintained individual identity while allowing unprecedented levels of empathy and understanding. Vornak's final computational fragments were preserved, not as a trophy, but as a point of study. The very beings who had sought to eliminate humanity now became the first students of human consciousness. "We didn't win through superior technology," Elena told the gathered species. "We won by being fundamentally, beautifully unpredictable." The galactic order had been completely transformed. Traditional concepts of war, communication, and civilization became obsolete. Humanity had introduced a new paradigm, a way of existing that valued emotional intelligence as the highest form of technological advancement. Dr. Chen looked at Elena, understanding that they had done something more than win a war. They had opened a door to an entirely new understanding of consciousness itself. The lullaby that had brought down an empire continued to resonate, a reminder that the most powerful force in the universe is not technology or military might, but the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be silenced.